Hey, welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Thursday, January 2nd, 2025. Happy New Year, everyone. And thank you for joining me while I talk to myself about Ohio State's 41-21 statement win over number one seed Oregon in the CFP quarterfinal at the Rose Bowl yesterday. The Buckeyes will advance to the semifinal round and a date with the 5-seed Texas Longhorns in the Cotton Bowl in Dallas on Friday, January 10th. I'm actually toying with the idea of going to that game. Now, the Buckeyes jumped out to a 34-0 first half lead and never really looked back, though Oregon did manage to go on a 15-0 run between their last possession of the second quarter and their first possession of the third quarter to cut the lead to 34-15. But the Buckeyes would snuff out the Ducks' comeback bid with a 6-play, 56-yard drive punctuated by an 8-yard Trey Henderson run late in the third quarter that pushed Ohio State's advantage out to 41-15 going into the fourth quarter. Ryan Day all season talked about his team leaving no doubt, and that is exactly what happened in this game. Ohio State outgained Oregon 500-276. The Buckeye defense, which did not record a sack of Dillon Gabriel in the first matchup on October 12th, sacked Gabriel a staggering 8 times yesterday. According to PFF, the Buckeyes pressured Gabriel on 32 of his 41 dropbacks. JT Tuimoloau led the way with 7 of those pressures and 2 sacks. Jack Sawyer was right behind him with 5 pressures, 2 sacks, and 3 batted passes. Cody Simon, who was named the game's defensive MVP, also recorded 2 sacks of Gabriel. Simon also finished with a game-high 11 tackles. The defense finished with 13 tackles for loss and held a very good Oregon rushing attack to minus 23 yards. Caleb Downs was a menace, patrolling the middle of the field for the Silver Bullets. Downs finished with the defense's highest PFF grades both for tackling and coverage. He also finished with the highest overall PFF grade for the starters. Knowles is using Downs as sort of a hybrid safety Mike linebacker type, and he was a nightmare for the Oregon passing attack. He finished the afternoon with 3 pass breakups. But the player everyone in college football is talking about today is freshman phenom receiver Jeremiah Smith. Smith finished the afternoon with 7 receptions on 10 targets for 187 yards and 2 touchdown catches. He had 63 yards after the catch in this game. Now, Smith started the scoring for the Buckeyes on their opening drive with a 45-yard catch and run on a drag route, which we've seen Emeka Egbuka score on many times in his career. Smith ran down the line of scrimmage behind his offensive line, caught a short pass from Will Howard in stride, and he was off to the races. Smith also scored on a 43-yard go route on a play where he was actually lined up in the slot that left him one-on-one with a safety. And suffice to say, that was not a favorable matchup for the Ducks. And with that touchdown, Smith broke the Big Ten record for touchdown receptions by a freshman. And he was also honored last night as the Rose Bowl offensive MVP. Now, in our preview pod, I was concerned about Will Howard's ability to protect the football in this game. Howard threw a red zone interception against Tennessee. That was his 4th red zone turnover of the season. He was also very lucky to have avoided a 2nd red zone turnover in that game on a bad handoff exchange with Quinshon Judkins. But yesterday, Howard was damn near surgical with every one of his throws, and he was in total command of the Ohio State offense. Howard finished the afternoon 17-26 for 319 yards, 3 touchdown passes, and no turnovers. I think his best throw of the afternoon was a 42-yard touchdown pass down the seam to Emeka Egbuka. Howard whistled the ball past the ear hole of the Oregon defensive back right into the arms of Egbuka as he crossed the goal line. That play was almost identical to Howard's 40-yard completion to Egbuka in the first quarter last Saturday against Tennessee. Egbuka finished the afternoon with 5 catches on 6 targets for 72 yards and a touchdown, which was his 10th of the season. With Jeremiah Smith getting all the attention, and rightfully so, Emeka Egbuka has become a silent assassin for this offense. The minute opposing defenses forget about him, he drives a stake into them with a catch like that 42-yarder yesterday. So, excellent game by Emeka Egbuka with some timely catches, including that 42-yarder. Another thing Paige and I discussed in our preview pod yesterday was whether Ohio State could take advantage of a porous Oregon run defense. The Ducks had a lot of trouble containing the run against Penn State in the Big Ten title game, allowing almost 300 yards on the ground that night. We thought Chip Kelly might try to throw to set up the run as the Buckeyes did against Tennessee, and that's exactly what happened. Now, Ohio State opened the game throwing 9 times on their first 12 plays from scrimmage, and that included the 45-yard catch and run for a touchdown by Smith and the 42-yard touchdown catch by Egbuka. Ohio State finished the first quarter with only 21 yards rushing on 8 attempts, but in the second quarter, the rushing attack exploded for 100 yards on 7 attempts. Trey Henderson's 66-yard touchdown run accounted for most of that yardage, but Quinshon Judkins also ran for 26 yards on 4 carries in that quarter. Ohio State finished the afternoon with 181 yards rushing at 5.8 yards per attempt. Henderson finished with 94 yards on 8 carries. Judkins finished with 85 yards on 17 carries. Look, in this offense, the Buckeyes don't need a lot from the rushing attack. But what they got yesterday, that is plenty good enough with what Ryan Day and Chip Kelly have been getting from the passing game. So, really nice output from the Ohio State run game yesterday. I think you could also call Trey Henderson a silent assassin in this offense, because the minute opposing defenses forget about him, he pops off a long touchdown run, or he's making a catch downfield on a wheel route or something like that. Now, Henderson finished with 11 touches for 114 total yards, and that included what was probably the knockout punch, the aforementioned 66-yard touchdown run midway through the second quarter. That put the Buckeyes up 31-zip. And it was at that point when I started to notice the body language of the Oregon defense. They looked very much like a defeated, exasperated unit at that stage. And I think back to this day 2 years ago, after that crushing 42-41 loss to Georgia in the Peach Bowl, and we lamented the absence of playmakers for the Buckeyes late in that game because of all the injuries. Marvin Harrison Jr. having to go out. They lose Cade Stover in that game. Jackson Smith and Jigba and Trey Henderson were unavailable to play that day. And I remember thinking what a difference Henderson would have made late in that game. But as we remember, his 2022 season was marred by injuries, and he could not play in the Peach Bowl. I got to give Carlos Loughlin and the Ohio State coaching staff a ton of credit for managing Henderson's usage this season and keeping him fresh so he could have the kind of impact that he's had this postseason. Of course, the acquisition of Quinshon Judkins during the offseason helped make that possible. Now, through 2 playoff games, TreVeyon Henderson has 248 total yards on 25 touches and 4 touchdowns. He's averaging 9.67 yards per carry running the football. He has become the perfect complement to a devastating Ohio State passing game. The last 2 games, the Buckeyes have gotten a stranglehold on the game with Smith, Egbuka, and Henderson, and then they turn to Quinshon Judkins to convert in short yardage situations and to eat up clock. It's glorious. And, that's the quartet that the coaching staff has really been leaning on so far in the playoffs. Smith, Egbuka, Henderson, and Judkins, with Will Howard, of course, as the trigger man. And I know that hasn't left a lot of opportunities for the likes of Carnell Tate, Brandon Innis, or Jelani Thurman. Those are young players that had started to come on toward the end of the season. Now, Tate has had the much bigger role of those 3, to be sure, and it must be a little frustrating for him not to be getting as many targets as he did down the stretch of the regular season. I hope he understands, and I'm sure he does, that his day will come. Tate and Jeremiah Smith will make up the best receiver duo in America next season. But he should stay ready, because he might be needed in the semis against Texas and potentially in the national championship game if the Buckeyes can get there. And also in our preview pod with Paige, I was very concerned about the Oregon defensive front against Ohio State's patchwork offensive line. Justin Fry has been using smoke and mirrors for the last 2 months to field a competent offensive line. And I wasn't sure if that group could handle Derek Harmon, Jordan Burch, and Mateo Uyunglele. Harmon came into this game with a staggering 52 pressures. Burch and Uyunglele had a combined 19 sacks. The Buckeyes did not see Burch in the first game because of an injury. He was available yesterday, and I really thought that trio would give the Ohio State offensive line some real problems, especially the interior where, Ohio State's been playing a lot of youth and inexperience. But yesterday, Oregon only managed 12 pressures of Will Howard. Harmon and Burch only had 3 apiece. Uyunglele was not credited with a pressure. Oregon was not credited with a sack either, and they only registered 3 tackles for loss. Now, Birch had a tackle on Will Howard that certainly looked like a sack to me, but it was officially scored as a tackle for loss, apparently. But that was probably the lone bright spot for the Oregon defensive front, was that tackle for loss that Birch had on Howard early in that game. After that, I thought the Ohio State offensive line completely shut that trio down. Donovan Jackson was outstanding once again, playing out of position at left tackle once again. Jackson finished with a pass blocking grade of 81.7. He's excellent. Now, the PFF grades for the rest of the offensive line are absurdly low and don't really match what my eyes told me watching the game, so I'm not going to bother mentioning them here. The bottom line is the Ohio State offense went for 500 yards, 41 points, and 5.8 yards per carry in the run game against the number 1 team in the country. You don't do that unless the big fellas up front aren't doing their jobs. One last thought on what we've seen from the offense during these playoffs, and I heard Joel Klatt talk about this in his post-game pod today. It took us 3 months to get here, and there were some bumps along the way, to be sure, namely the first Oregon matchup and the Nebraska and Michigan flops. But what we're seeing now is the perfect marriage between Chip Kelly's run game concepts and Ryan Day's passing game. And they're doing it with the best offensive skill talent in the country. That has to be a frightening prospect for the rest of the playoff field. Now, I said before kickoff yesterday, I could not remember a game on which so much was riding for an Ohio State head coach than this quarterfinal game for Ryan Day. Not only did it have the typical high stakes of a playoff game, it was also about Ohio State's standing within its own conference. Ryan Day was a combined 0-6 against Michigan and Oregon since 2021 before yesterday. A loss in this game, and there would have been no reasonable argument you could make for Ohio State being any better than the third best team in the Big Ten, and probably much worse than that if we're talking about the program's national standing. But a win, especially one as emphatic as this one, reestablishes Ohio State's supremacy within the Big Ten. I mean, I just could not envision a world where the Buckeyes had slipped that far to number 3 within its own conference and within the region, quite frankly, because Notre Dame, with a former Ohio State player running that program, is also on the come up. But no matter what happens from here on out in these playoffs, Ryan Day, Chip Kelly, and Jim Knowles have restored Ohio State's supremacy within the Big Ten. That is extremely important to ardent supporters of the program like me. I was as critical as any fan of Ryan Day after the Michigan loss, and rightfully so. But what Day and his staff have accomplished through these first 2 rounds of the playoffs, and what they've managed to do in the transfer portal over the last 10 days, by the way, has restored my faith in their leadership. Now, there's still a lot of work to do before we can consider this season a true success relative to this program's talent and resources, right? To whom much is given, much is expected, as they say. And natty or bust, that has been the team's mantra, and they're only halfway there. But for now, soak this one up, Buckeye fans. This was an emphatic win over a matchup opponent in a truly meaningful game. We have not had a victory like this since the 2020 CFP win over Clemson. That was 5 years ago. So savor this one, Buckeye fans. It's beautiful. So now we turn our gaze to Friday, January 10th, and the 5-seeded Texas Longhorns. The Longhorns blew a 16-point fourth quarter lead and had to hang on for dear life to beat Arizona State 39-31 in double overtime in the Peach Bowl yesterday afternoon. I'm going to have a lot more to say about this game. I plan to wrangle Paige and Chad, if Chad can fit us into his busy social calendar, for a preview pod of this game. But one thing that really stands out to me about this matchup is Texas is, I think, the first opponent the Buckeyes will face this season that is equal to them in pure talent. According to the 24/7 team talent composite, Ohio State is number 3. Texas is right behind them at number 4, and they are very close when it comes to 5-star talent. And the Longhorns are pretty much the Buckeyes' equal defensively as well. Texas and Ohio State have been widely regarded as the 2 best defensive teams in these playoffs. The Longhorns defense features the Sean Alexander Freshman of the Year defensive end Colin Simmons and this year's Thorpe Award winner cornerback Jahdae Barron. And of course, all Ohio State fans remember quarterback Quinn Ewers, who spent 1 year at Ohio State in 2021 before transferring to Texas. Now, Ewers has been good this season, but not great. He threw a terrible pick late in the fourth quarter against Arizona State yesterday that allowed the Sun Devils to rally and force overtime in that game. Ewers' completion percentage and yards per attempt are down from a year ago, and he's almost doubled his interception total from last year. Ewers has 11 picks, and he's been sacked a staggering 27 times this season. Pay attention to that number. 27 sacks already for Ewers against an Ohio State pass rush that is at its zenith right now. That is a matchup I really like for the Buckeyes. Now, Texas benefits from playing this game in Dallas. It should be a decisively pro-Texas crowd. I'm planning to be there unless it's like utterly cost prohibitive for me to be there. But again, I like this matchup for the Buckeyes, and so does Vegas. The early line in this game is Ohio State -6. The over-under is 53.5. Again, much more to say about this matchup in the coming days. That's going to do it for me. Look for a preview of the Cotton Bowl from at the very least Paige and me, and possibly Chad. Until then, thanks so much for listening. Happy New Year, and go Bucks. You've been listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.